Good evening to all of you in Atlanta. This year will deal with the 10th of the 13 principles of faith of the Rambam. In the Rambam's own words in his commentary to the Mishnah, the Rambam presents this principle as follows. Hayisodo Asiri, the 10th principle, who Sha'Hashem Yisborach Yodeim Asayim Shel Bnei Adam, that God knows the deeds of people, Velo Azavosam, and he did not abandon the world after he created it. And then the Rambam brings various verses to demonstrate this. In the Ani Mamins, it presents a little bit different aspect. Ani Mamin B'Emunah Shleima Shahabore Yisborach Yodea Kol Ma'aseh B'nei Adam. I believe with perfect faith that the Creator knows all the actions of people, umachshavosam, and their thoughts. And it brings a verse to support this. Shenemar hayotzer yachad libam hamevin al kol ma'aseihem. God created their hearts and knows everything they do. The author of the Ani Mamin added that God not only knows the deeds of people, but also their thoughts. He also provided a verse different than the verses that the Rambam brings to support this principle, and unusual because in all the other 12 Ani Mamins, no verse is brought. This is the only one where the author of the Ani Mamin sees necessary to bring a verse. This principle is referred to in the poem Yigdal in the following way. So Fev Yodea Sisorenu, God knows and sees all that is secret about us. Mabit L'Sof Dovor B'Kadmoso, and he sees the end from the beginning. In other words, God sees even into the future. This adds another dimension. Not only does God know everything hidden, actions and thoughts, but he also sees it before it happens. He sees into the future. Perhaps the Rambam did not see it necessary to mention these two additional points, that God not only knows the actions, but the thoughts, and not only does he know as it happens, but he knows it before it happens, because that's included in the first two principles. That God is the creator beyond time, which the Rambam says, and therefore since God is not limited by time, his knowledge is not limited by time, and there's no difference between the past, present, and future. So that's included in that principle. And the fact that God is not corporeal, but he is spiritual, so of course God does not only know the actions, but he knows the thoughts also. So the first two principles make it clear that if God is involved in the world and knows what is going on, it's not limited only to actions, but also to thought, and it's not limited in time, but it transcends time. We can now elaborate on this principle to explain many other things. Firstly, the Rambam explains that if Adam Harishon knew God, how did idolatry develop in the world? The Rambam says that in the Torah of Enosh and the generation of Enosh, people made a terrible mistake. And they reasoned that if God gave such tremendous powers, physical and spiritual powers, to the various planets and stars and angels and so on, that it would follow that one should honor God by honoring those things that he gave power to. Just as one honors the emissaries of the king as an honor to the king. And they began by building edifices to honor these physical and spiritual powers as an honor to God. And eventually it degenerated. They forgot that they're honoring God. They began to think that these powers have individual power, and they began to worship them and eventually they forgot about the Rabbanim completely. Question is, what was this terrible mistake? Isn't it true that one honors the emissaries of the king as an honor to the king? Perhaps the answer is that you only honor the emissary of the king when the king is not there. But in the king's presence, you don't honor the emissary. That's an affront to the king who is standing right there. Honor him directly. That is known as the principle in Cholkin Kovod L'Talmid B'Makom Harav. You don't give honor to the student in the presence of the teacher, only in his absence. And that, in fact, was a terrible mistake. They assumed that God is not present, that God is so great, that why would he want to have anything to do with this lowly world and lowly people? So God has appointed emissaries to take care of this lowly world, and he is beyond that, above that, and therefore it's not in God's presence, and it's proper to honor these things. That was their mistake. And that's what it says in Hallel, describing how the non-Jewish world looks at God. Rom al kol goyim Hashem al hashamayim kevodo. God in their eyes is high and aloof, and somewhere up there in the heavens, having nothing to do with this lowly world. And therefore God appointed emissaries, whether it's his son or a cousin or uncle or the stars or whatever, to deal with this lowly world. And therefore it's proper to give honor to those emissaries. But the true perspective, as it continues in Hallel, Mi kashem Elokeinu, who is like our personal God. Hamagbil Hashavas, yes, God is way up there. But Hamashpili Liros Bashamayim Va'aretz. But he looks down and sees and is concerned about every single lowly thing that happens in this world. This is the idea that Rabbi Yochanan said. We say it, it's a Gemara in Megillah, but we say it every Motzei Shabbos in V'yitei Lecha, that the Chomokum Shata Motzei Gvuraso Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, wherever the Torah makes a point to tell us how great God is, immediately after it tells us that he's involved in every lowly thing in this world. Because if you don't understand that, then you are going to be prone to make the mistake that started off idolatry. Perhaps this is the meaning when it says in the Aseret Adibros, Lo yiyeh lecha Elohim acherim al ponai. Do not have any other powers, no other gods before me in my presence. Rashi says, as long as I am around. Meaning that if God wouldn't be around, then maybe you could show honor to other powers. But since God is always around, he's always concerned and involved with what goes on in this lowly world, there's no place to give honor to anything except the Rabbanu Shalom, and therefore there's no place for any kind of idolatry. And one would think that this mistake was predicated on a feeling of humility and lowliness, that the people felt so low that why would God want to have anything to do with us? But the truth is just the opposite. They probably reasoned that if they would be God, they wouldn't have anything to do with these lowly people. So they transferred their gava, their haughtiness, to God, and assumed that God wouldn't have anything to do with this lowly world. And therefore Chazal say, one idea perhaps, Kol hamizgoeh ki'ilu over avodah zarah. A person who's haughty is as if he's serving idolatry. Because being haughty, you can transfer your haughtiness to God and assume that God wouldn't want to have anything to do with this lowly world, just like you wouldn't want to have anything to do with the lowly world if you're a God. So therefore haughtiness and idolatry have a connection. A question that is raised here is, why is it necessary to have a separate principle that God knows and is involved in what goes on in the world, when the next principle tells me that God rewards and punishes for sins and for mitzvahs? If God rewards and punishes, obviously he's involved and knows what goes on. So why is it necessary to have a separate principle telling us that God knows what goes on when it could have been included altogether in the next principle, that if God rewards and punishes, obviously he knows what's going on. Perhaps an answer can be the following. The Shurei Das, amongst others, explains that there are two possible ways of understanding reward and punishment, mitzvahs and averos. One way is called Melech Mitzav El Ha'am. King commands his subjects, where the command may not have any intrinsic reason for it, but the king wants to make his subjects subject to discipline, to learn how to be disciplined. So he gives them commands. Do this, don't do that. And if you follow his command, you will get rewarded. And if you go against his command, you get punished. And that is, reward and punishment comes from the king. Or perhaps it's the function of a doctor advising his patient. Example, you go to the doctor, tells you that you're allergic to watermelon. If you eat watermelon, you're going to have a fatal allergic reaction. So if you eat the watermelon, the doctor's not going to punish you. The watermelon will punish you. God being the ultimate creator, so he told us which things are beneficial and which things are detrimental. If you do the beneficial ones, they'll benefit you. If you do the detrimental ones, they'll harm you. So it's not a reward or punishment coming from the king. It's from the things themselves that generate that reward or punishment. The Shurei Das explains that with some exceptions, most mitzvahs and averos have both ideas. They're like drug laws. The government does not want you to be a drug addict, and therefore it makes laws that if you become a drug addict, you could be prosecuted and put in prison. At the same time, the addiction itself is going to harm you. So God, as the doctor and the king, command you to do those things that are beneficial and prohibit you from doing those things that are detrimental. And therefore, if I only had the principle that there's a concept of reward and punishment, I might think that has nothing to do with God himself being involved in what a person does in this world. It's just that God created the world in such a way that there are things that are beneficial for a person to do and things that are detrimental. But it's totally detached and very impersonal connection that the mitzvahs and averos have. It's not a direct connection between the king and the person, but it's a result of the way that God created the world. It doesn't necessitate that God is aware and has a connection on an ongoing basis to people. The fact that we have this principle, that God is involved and knows what people do and what they think and what the results and implications of their deeds have, shows that the Ribono Shel Olam considers important what human beings do, everything we do. The idea of zichronos on Rosh Hashanah, that God remembers, does not necessarily mean that he remembers what happened in the past, because by God there is no time, and since he can't forget, there can't be remembering. But remembrance can also mean to show importance, right? Just like forgetting can mean to not consider something important. Like if somebody says something and someone else says, I didn't catch what you said, and you said, forget about it. That doesn't mean to forget it because you didn't hear it. It means it's not important. So God's remembering us means that he takes into consideration that we're important, and everything we do is important. And the Rabbeinu Yonah says that that is basically the foundation of all service to God. Hakoros ma'alos atzmo, that a person should recognize his intrinsic worth in God's eyes. Because if he thinks he's worth nothing, then why would God want a nothing to serve him? And also, if he thinks he's good for nothing, then why should he have any deterrent from doing terrible things if good for nothing things do good for nothing things? But if a person is important, and what he does is important, not only important, but universally important and eternally important, so then it is not befitting such an important person to do things that are inappropriate. The Telzer Rosh Yeshiva of Meir Bloch explains that that's what we say after we confess our sins. Oshamnu Bogadnu. We say, Ovarnu Amitzvosecho Mishpatecho Atovim. We transgress your good and just laws. Velo Shava Lanu. Simple meaning, wasn't worth it. Lo Haya Shaveh. Wasn't worth it. We didn't gain what we thought we gained from it. But he says a different idea. Lo Shava Lanu means in Yiddish, is nicht mir zugepasst. It's not befitting me. Because if this is the only thing I can do, is to do these terrible things, if that's all I'm capable of, so what am I confessing? That's me. But if it's not befitting me, it's not appropriate for me, I'm way beyond that and way above that, then there's something to confess, that I function in a very inappropriate manner for such a very important creation. And recognizing one's intrinsic worth in God's eyes is not haughtiness. The difference between ga'ava, haughtiness, which is a prohibited thing, and recognizing your inherent intrinsic value is the following. Ga'ava, haughtiness, is I'm important because I made myself important, and that gives me rights. And recognizing your intrinsic worth and self-value is I'm important because God made me important, and that gives me responsibility. A major question that this principle raises is the conflict between if God knows everything that's going to be, even before it happens, and how can we have free choice? If God knew before I was born if I was going to be giving this shear now or robbing the First National Bank, then do I have free choice to go and rob the First National Bank? If God knew I was giving to give the shear, then it's impossible for me to now go and rob the bank because God knew differently. And if it's possible for me to rob the bank, that means that God didn't know. So how do these two principles, that God knows what's going to be in the future before it happens, and at the same time I have free choice? The Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva raises this question and basically says that it's beyond our comprehension to answer it because we don't have an idea of how God's knowledge works. We know our own kind of knowledge, that we know something before it happens, and if we know it, then it has to happen. And if we doesn't have to happen, then we didn't know it. But God's knowledge is completely different. The Ravid has a problem with the Rambam. Why do you raise questions that you have no answer for? The Ravid gives an answer that God knows, like an astronomer knows, where there's going to be an eclipse of the moon. He knows that in next year or 2 or 3, there's going to be an eclipse on this and this day based on his knowledge of the forces in power, in effect. But he doesn't control it. But that is a very difficult answer, since it limits God's knowledge completely and makes him just a distant observer. And therefore, they explain that the Rambam is not avoiding the question, but he's answering the question. That is the answer. Our minds are very limited to only things that are within our realm. Things that are totally outside of our realm, our minds have no ability to grasp. I'll give you an example. Close your eyes and imagine nothing. So what do you see? Empty space. You can put your hand into that nothing. That's not nothing. That's space. Imagine now nothing, no space. Impossible. Because we don't live in an existence where there is no space. So our minds can't grasp it. Imagine a monster that's of something that you never saw and never heard. Impossible. You never saw and never heard it. You have absolutely no connection to it. What can you imagine? A monster with 5 heads and 6 arms and 7 legs? But they're all things that you've heard or seen. So our minds cannot grasp anything outside of our realm. And therefore even our understanding of God starts only from creation. The name that we don't even say, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, means that God is the creator. He brought everything into creation. But God before creation we don't have a name for, because it's beyond our comprehension. And therefore the Mishnah says you're not allowed to ask what came before the creation and what's beyond the universe. Not necessarily because it's prohibited, because it's impossible. It's beyond, it's out of our realm. Our minds can't grasp it. And therefore God's knowledge is beyond our grasp. It's a knowledge that doesn't depend on time. There's no past, present, future. It's all one time, which is beyond our comprehension. We can't even express what it is. So our question is only based on our understanding of knowledge. If we would know something before it happens, either it has to happen or we didn't know. But God's knowledge is not before, after, there's no such thing. And therefore it's beyond our comprehension. They give an example to this. Imagine if you have a person who has no sense of touch, no sense of depth. He sees everything in 2 dimensions, and he has a mental block against mirrors. And you put 2 candles on the table in front of a mirror, and you tell him there's a mitzvah to believe there are 2 candles on that table. What does he see? 4 candles. So tell him to touch them. These you can touch, and these are just a reflection. He has no sense of touch. Tell him, well, these are 3-dimensional, and these are only 2-dimensional. No, he has no sense of depth. Explain to him, this is a mirror. He has a mental block towards mirrors. According to his limitations, there's no way for him to believe that there are 2 candles. He sees 4 candles. But give him an operation so he can now touch, see in depth, and understand what mirrors are. There's no more problem. It's clear. There's 2 candles and there's a mirror. But according to his limitations before this, there is no way that he could possibly understand that there's only 2 candles on that table. So too, we are asking the question because of our limitations. We don't understand the knowledge that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has. His knowledge is not from the outside. It's intrinsic. He is the creator, and everything that is created continues to be created and exist only because God wills it every second to exist. And that's beyond time. That's beyond our comprehension. So there's only a conflict between God's foreknowledge and our free choice if you use our knowledge as the base for the question. But if we can understand God's knowledge, we see that there's no conflict, there's no question at all. And therefore, we must look at it in the following way, that God knows everything, yet his knowledge does not conflict with our free choice, and that's a miracle. And basically, the way we can understand it in a practical way is that God deals with us in a way that allows us to have free choice. How that works, we're not able to understand. But God, therefore, limits his knowledge, per se, to fit our needs. And that explains a few different things. It says that someone who gives people the benefit of the doubt, God gives him the benefit of the doubt. Now, benefit of the doubt means a doubt, that you're not sure. You see somebody do something, goes into a non-kosher restaurant, and you're not sure why he went in. Did he go in to eat not kosher, or did he go in to use the bathroom facilities? So you have to give him the benefit of the doubt. But God knows everything. Where is there a doubt? How can God give someone the benefit of the doubt? The answer is that God deals with us according to our limitations. And therefore, his functioning with us leaves room for giving us the benefit of the doubt, even though God ultimately has no doubts, and his knowledge is absolute. But he deals with us as if he would have a doubt. With this idea, we can also understand the following. There are various different kinds of hashgacha, how God deals and directs the affairs of human beings, of animals, of the world in general. And we have in the desert, it was called hashgacha nisis, a miraculous direction that God gave. He was involved in everything that happened in a miraculous way, splitting the Red Sea and giving 10 plagues, and a pillar of fire at night and a cloud in the daytime leading them. And as soon as they sinned, the repercussions and the results were immediate. And so too when they did mitzvos, the reward was imminent and it was clear. And then when we came to Eretz Yisrael, the hashgacha, the divine providence, changed. And it was through nature. God dealt with us through nature. Natural means, but still miraculous. Because if it was to rain or not, didn't depend on high pressure systems and low pressure systems. It depended on were the Jewish people keeping the mitzvahs or not. Then I'll give you your rain in the proper time, and if not, not. And people knew that if they made a survey and Jewish people were keeping the mitzvahs, it's going to rain. That's a miracle, but it's a miracle that happened through natural means, through rain, through agriculture, or whatever. But it was clear that the causes were spiritual causes. In the desert, everything was miraculous. They didn't have to plant food and nurture it and need rain, but the man came from the heavens, and the water came from a rock. And then, after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we had another kind of hashgacha, another kind of divine providence, which is called Hesterpunning, where God hides his face. And we don't see the correlation between Torah and mitzvahs and the results in this world. But we seem to see that things happen by chance or the result of political, economic, social causes. That's called Hesterpunning. Says the Vilna Gaon that the truth is that from God's standpoint, it's all the same. God is intricately, intrinsically involved in every single thing that happens in this world. There is no coincidence and no accident and no happenstance. The difference only is how we see it. Sometimes we saw it as open miracles, sometimes as hidden miracles through the agency of what we call nature, and sometimes it's hidden completely. We don't see God's hand. And Purim came to tell us that even where we don't see God openly, but he's behind the scenes. And he's always the one who is guiding what happens in the world, except from our standpoint, we don't see it. So God deals with us according to our level. And therefore the Ramban says that a tzaddik who is very much attached to God, a prophet, has hashgacha pratis. Everything that happens to him is divinely guided in a way that he can see it. And the less attached you are to the Ribono Shel Olam, the less of a divine providence you have, but not from God's side, from how it appears to us. And that is the idea, and therefore human beings have a more intimate divine providence, whereas animals have a divine providence that is more general. But again, that's only how we see it, not how it actually is, because even every single thing that happens in the world, a leaf falls from a tree. From our standpoint, that's not divine providence, as the Rambam says in Moreh Nevuchim. But from God's standpoint, nothing happens in this world without God being involved, because everything exists only because God wants it to exist every second. So therefore, as the Baal Shem Tov and the Hasidim say, there's nothing in this world that's not divine providence. That's from God's side, not necessarily how it appears to us. And now we can understand why in this animamin, in this principle, the author saw it necessary to bring a verse to support it. Perhaps the answer is the following. Since the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos only mentioned that God knows the actions of people, and he let you understand, take it for granted, that if God knows the actions, he knows the thoughts too, since the Rambam already said in the first principle that God brought everything into existence, and in the second principle that God is not corporeal, the third principle, and God is totally ethereal and spiritual and not physical. So the Rambam didn't have to say that God knows thoughts, because obviously if God knows actions, he knows thoughts too. And the Rambam didn't have to say that God knows things before they happen, because God is above time, as the Rambam said in the first and second principle. But now in the Animamin, he had to bring a verse that would tell us these extra things that the Rambam took for granted. And that is, Animamin b'emunah shlema, Shabore Yisborach Shemo Yodea Kol Ma'aseh B'nei Adam V'chol Machshavosam. He knows also our thoughts. So where is the source that he knows thoughts to? This pasuk, Hayotzer Yachad Libam. God created the hearts of people, meaning the minds of people. So he not only doesn't know their actions, he knows their thoughts, because he's involved intrinsically in every part of a human being, including our thoughts. Also, the Animamin had to answer the question, how do we know that God knows everything if there's free choice, reward and punishment, which is clear in the Torah? The whole Torah is promulgated on mitzvahs and averos, so there obviously has to be free choice. Because if you don't have free choice, why should you be punished for doing bad and rewarded for doing good if you're a robot? So that's clear from the Torah itself that there's free choice. But if that's contradicted by God's foreknowledge, how do we know that God has that foreknowledge? So you need a sentence to tell me that this principle is true, despite the fact that it seems to contradict free choice, which is obvious as a pillar and foundation of the whole Torah. So you need a sentence to tell me, Hayotzer Yachad Libon, Hamnevin Al Kol Ma'aseihem, that God knows because he created everything, and his knowledge is not a knowledge from the outside as an observer, but his knowledge is intrinsic. He knows his creation because his creation is kibiyachol part of him. It's a result of his constant will. So of course he knows what everything is, and since God's will is beyond time, so he knows everything before it happens too, because there is no time by the Rabbanu Shalom. So in order to include these extra things, that God not only knows action, but he knows thoughts, and not only does he know it as it happens, but he knows it before it happens, beyond time. That's what this sentence tells me, and the sentence is important because otherwise we would not understand this Animamin properly, and we would think that it conflicts with next Animamin, that people have free choice based on the fact that God rewards and punishes, and if we didn't have free choice, there would be no place for reward and punishment, and that's something that's clear in the Torah. So how do I know that this principle is true? Maybe since it conflicts with the other principle, it's not true at all. So he had to bring a verse to tell me that God's knowledge is not just limited to what he sees from the outside physically, but it's intrinsic to the creations that he created. Hayotzer Yachad Liba goes to the very heart of creation, and therefore the thoughts are also included. And that this principle is true, even though it seems to contradict the concept of free choice. But like we explained, there's no contradiction, because the contradiction is only based on our understanding of knowledge, our kind of knowledge. Then there's a contradiction and a conflict. But if we could understand how God knows, then there'd be no question, but it's something beyond our comprehension, and therefore there's no conflict. And the Rabbi Shalom functions with us sometimes as if he doesn't know and allows us to have free choice, even though ultimately the way that God's knowledge is absolutely, there's no conflict at all. That, in my estimation, sums up this principle and explains why it's presented by the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos the way that he presents it, why in the Animamin is added another dimension. Not only does God know action, he knows thoughts also, which the Rambam didn't have to mention, like we said, because it's included in the first three principles also. And why in the Animamin he had to bring a sentence, unlike all the other Animamins, because this seems to conflict with the next principle, which is obvious that it is true, because the whole Torah is predicated on reward and punishment. And if that's the case, then maybe this principle is not necessarily a principle. Maybe God doesn't have foreknowledge, and that he had to bring a pasuk to tell me this principle is true, even regarding the foreknowledge of the Ribono Shel Olam. And still there's no question, because the question is only based on our understanding of knowledge as we understand it, and not on the absolute knowledge of the Ribono Shel Olam. And that's why it was and also Hayotzer Yachad Libam, that God's knowledge is not something that emanates from a creation of nature in a certain way, that Mamela there's reward and punishment, because that's how God set up the world. But it's an intimate, close relationship that God has with human beings, and considers what they do very important, universally and eternally. And therefore the knowledge that God has is not just a knowledge like a Shabbos clock, that he put the world on a Shabbos clock of nature, and there are repercussions if you do what is beneficial or you do what is detrimental. But there's a concept of the king knowing intimately and being interested intimately in what people do, which means that people are extremely important and have that close, intimate relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam, not just a cold, natural relationship where God's knowledge is not the king knowing and attaching himself and having an interaction with human beings, not just a result of the nature of how God created the world. All those three things are included in that verse that the Animamin, the author of the Animamin, felt necessary to add to this principle. I hope this has opened your eyes and to this principle, given you what to think about and what to discuss together with your Rabbonim in the remainder of the time that you have for this year. Good night to all of you.